Welcome to the Libertarian Institute podcast. Today, I'm joined by Jeremy R. Hammond, my colleague at the Libertarian Institute. He is the author of Ron Paul versus Paul Krugman, Austrian versus Keynesian Economics in the Financial Crisis. Right now at the Libertarian Institute, we are hosting our 2025 fund drive. So if you would like to make a donation to help us spread the message of social cooperation, voluntarism, and freedom, please check out libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Pick up one of our books. We would greatly appreciate it. What I want to do is give people an idea of what we're doing at the Institute by going through an article and doing somewhat of a propaganda analysis so people can see the great intellectual giants that I am having the pleasure of being surrounded by. Mr. Hammond, thank you for your time, brother.
Sure thing. Nice to speak with you again.
What year did you write this book, Ron Paul versus Paul Krugman?
2012, when Ron Paul was running again, and I was having to tolerate on Facebook and everywhere else, constantly seeing people saying what a kook Ron Paul was and how he had all these crazy economic ideas, and we need to listen to Paul Krugman. He's the wise guy who knows everything. And I was just kind of looking back and thinking, well, now hold on a minute. Let's compare their records on the housing bubble and see who's the kook, right? And so I just wrote that book. It's just a short, it started out as an article. It turned into such a long article that I figured, well, I'll publish it as a short book. But that's what that book is. It literally just goes through and compares like their statements. Like going back to 2000, when Ron Paul was warning that the Fed's monetary inflation was going to cause a housing bubble. And of course, Paul Krugman was advocating that exact policy.
Yes.
Explicitly for the purpose of fueling a boom in housing. And we know how that turned out. So it's a fun little book.
Paul Krugman has done us a great favor and has summarized his worldview in this article titled The Ignoramus Strategy from April of 2013. Basically, his thesis is, if you want to argue against Keynesian economics, he goes, this is the most important book in economics ever. It even surpasses The Wealth of Nations. He has actually said that. So he summarizes his Keynesian worldview in 5 points. I want us to go one by one, and you tell me what, if anything, is wrong with Paul Krugman's worldview here. So point number 1, the economy isn't like an individual family that earns a certain amount and spends some other amount with no relationship between the two. My spending is your income, and your spending is my income. If we both slash spending, both of our incomes fall. Are you able to detect any fallacies with this perfect analysis of the economy?
Well, sure. He's talking about, and if that kind of goes into the second point there that he has in the article, but just to stick with that, he's talking about savings being a bad thing. He wants people spending. This is the Keynesian view that economic growth comes from people spending. And I spend dollars, they end up in your pocket, and then you have a job and you earn money from the money that I spend, and then you can go and spend that money, and then it ends up in somebody else's pocket, and it's just this cycle, right? Which is kind of just a fundamentally incorrect view of what economic growth is and where it comes from. Because what savings is deferred spending, which is capital accumulation. And so to be able to invest capital, you have to have capital accumulated to invest. And so we shouldn't be viewing saving people, if people are saving in the economy, and there's high rates of savings, well, then banks can utilize the deposits as reserves for lending. Entrepreneurs, investors can then go borrow the money and invest it. And they can, by doing that, that's what enables them to produce goods and services that are ever better at ever lower costs. And that's what economic growth is. It's when we have an increased standard of living. And so, I think this comment of his that my spending is, your income and and vice versa. I think it's a reflection of the Keynesian view that economic growth comes from spending.
When he says, my spending is your income, I don't know if I highly doubt Paul Krugman has ever bought any of the products and services that I sell in exchange for my labor. These are different groups interacting. Once you just start selling something, you might be a business that goes out of business and you might not receive any spending from other people. So he's assuming that there's not people making decisions and engaging in value for value transactions. He goes, if you're spending, you're in the category called spending. If you're not spending, you're in the not spending category.
Right.
It doesn't occur to him that there are people creating less value and getting less dollars allocated to them in the scarce, resources that the economy has to distribute. So I don't even agree with that. Your spending is not my income, and
Right.
your spending is my income. You know what? That actually is a little true because I bought in 2 of his books. Against my better judgment, I had to get in the mind of Paul
You.
Krugman. Okay, my spending is a small fraction of his income. If we both slash spending, both of our incomes fall. This is an actual line that is written here. I want to pull it up on the screen. As though your income couldn't stagnate or increase while you're decreasing your expenditures. I used to spend a lot of money going out to dinner, getting drinks, being the cool guy who bought drinks for everyone, and then I was broke. So my spending decreased. And after this was about 10 years ago, I've been able to have a job where I acquired on the job skills and I could demand a higher wage because they knew I could go to a competitor. So my income increased while my spending fell. It is not even close to being true. If we both slash spending, both of our incomes will fall. That is not the case at all. This is a lot of, guys my age with terrible impulse control when they're 16 and they get their first job.
Yeah.
We tend to spend a lot and earn a little, and then we earn more and spend less because we're actually economizing on our dollars. Anything more on just this first point before we go to the second?
Yeah, just to mention real quick that he's talking about this Keynesian idea of aggregate demand, right? Where, I mean, everything that you just said, is so true that's just not the case. It's just literally not true. What he's saying is not true. But even in terms of like this concept of aggregate demand, that there's somehow this problem of this population-wide problem of people aren't spending enough money, and they're trying to save instead of spend their money, and that's the problem. So it's just this kind of concept of aggregate demand that I think he kind of gets more into. That's kind of a segue to the second point he makes there in the next paragraph. So we can just proceed.
Point number 2. We are now in a situation in which many people have cut spending, either because they chose to or because their creditors forced them to, while relatively few people are willing to spend more. The result is depressed incomes and a depressed economy with millions of willing workers unable to find jobs. What, if anything, is wrong with that analysis? People have cut spending, therefore you're killing the multiplier effect.
Right. So again, he's basically saying, savings is bad and spending is good, but this kind of it doesn't reflect how economic growth actually occurs. So, interest rates are an important price in the economy. They're the price signals to entrepreneurs and investors for how to allocate resources. And so government spending equals debt monetization, which equals manipulation of interest rates. And so when the government does all the spending and they don't do it by directly taxing necessarily, they're going to just print the money, so to speak, through the Fed. And so the Fed monetary inflation manipulates the interest rates throughout the economy. And so, if you had a free market situation, a high rate of savings would indicate people's preference for deferring spending to the future. And so you'd have high accumulation of capital that could be borrowed and invested, which again, that's how producers are able to produce better goods and services at lower costs, which is economic growth. And if there's insufficient capital available, then that's a problem. Businesses can't borrow and invest to advance means of production. But the monetary inflation just creates these artificially low interest rates, which creates this illusion that there's a large pool of capital available for borrowing and spending. And so you might have this influx of growth in some industry in the economy. But then all these projects are started as a result of that. But then because that capital, it was illusory, and that capital wasn't really there because it was just money created out of thin air. And so ultimately, many of those projects are going to fail. And so we have all this massive malinvestment. And so savings is a good thing. That's how, because again, the interest rate is a price, and it's a price signaling the accumulation of capital to be borrowed and spent and invested. And so the government spending and the debt monetization and the money printing manipulates that price signal in ways that just causes distortions all throughout the economy and all kinds of widespread malinvestment. So that's kind of the problem with his argument on that point, I would say. Interested in your thoughts as well.
If we look at the potential benefits of postponing consumption, I don't know. I guess his assumption is that there's no such thing as an equilibrium. We either have to spend or we save we either spend everything or we save everything, as opposed to there being a happy balance, which interest rates incentivize or disincentivize. So when he says many people have cut spending, this could be a good thing. Maybe they're saving up for a computer. Maybe they're saving up for a car, for a larger purchase down the line. Maybe they're saving up for a house or just a down payment on a house. Maybe they're trying to invest in a small business. People go through a lot of spending cuts when they first start a small business because there's a great deal of uncertainty that's taking place. He also uses the word spending to equate the state coercively taking money and spending it on your behalf as a involuntary surrogate decision maker, and people exchanging value for value goods. I can't believe he doesn't see this blatant distinction between things people choose and things people do not choose to fund. That is the other thing. And then when many people have cut spending, that means they are saving money. That means banks have more money to lend out to more businesses to engage in building factories. It's like he wants us all to quick spend money, go out to dinner and spend it right now, as if the money isn't eventually going to be spent in different ways. Whenever you look at a big, big building that employs a lot of people, that was not the result of people engaging in low impulse control behavior and just thinking, what am I in the mood for now? This. It takes years of planning because those plans aren't coming to fruition yet. You're postponing the plan, so you have to postpone the money you spend on those plans. So I don't know how he thinks these semiconductor factories are ever going to get built when we've spent all the money because people haven't saved. Just absolute nonsense on this.
The smart investors and entrepreneurs are going to recognize that high rates of savings just equals pent up demand for the future. It's deferred spending. And so they're going to invest in those things that, to meet that future demand. And so there's no fundamental problem here. And in Krugman views this as like a fundamental problem, but the thing is it's not. It's a non-issue, at least in the free market economy. So when
he says either because they chose to or because their creditors forced them to, well, if creditors had more access to savings from people engaging in postponing consumption, then they'd have more money to lend out. When he says the result is depressed incomes and a depressed economy, I don't see the problem with like where the world was in the year 500 AD as, well, people just didn't spend enough. No, they didn't save enough and then postpone consumption and engage in productive activities, which increase the value of labor. I think of the time when one of my early jobs was working at Walmart online grocery pickup. And one day our handheld devices went down. So we had to do everything by hand. These handheld devices, I bet they're $5,000 each or something. So we'd have to take a call. We're still using phones, so there's still some capital investment we're working with. We'd use the phone, take down the person's name, and write down every single thing they wanted us to grab. And it was less reliable because they couldn't specify on the app exactly what they wanted. So all of us workers were like 10 times less productive because we didn't have access to that capital investment. That capital investment only existed as a causal result of savings or from investors who have also postponed consumption. So I don't even agree that the result is depressed incomes. I think it would
Right.
raise incomes if people postponed consumption, invested in machines, which made workers more productive and more valuable.
Hmm.
So um,
Yeah,
he's just so
he's
wrong on
also
these first two. His foundation's wrong.
well, he's
No
also
wonder everything else
completely
is bullshit.
he's also completely misdiagnosing the cause of the slump at this point. Because he's saying that the reason we have this economic slump with this high unemployment is because people aren't spending enough, and there's this, the aggregate demand in the economy is low, and so there's just this, people aren't spending like they should be. But I mean, that's not why there's a slump, right? In the first place, the reason there's a slump is because we have the Fed-induced boom bust cycle, right? And so he's completely misdiagnosing the problem to begin with. I mean, and so of course, as always, I mean, we go back to 2008 and the housing bubble that he advocated, and he was saying the same thing, the same thing there, that, what the government needs to do now to fight this recession is more money printing, of course, which of course it's always more of the same that caused the problem in the first place to solve the problem. So it's just like he's just misdiagnosing the cause of the problem in the first place, to advocate doing more of the same, basically.
So when he ends this second point with millions of willing workers unable to find jobs, okay, say that I am a willing worker. What kind of society would I like to be in? One with a lot of capital investment that came about as the result of savings, or one with no capital investment? That no capital investment is a hand to mouth economy where everything you work to produce, you consume that day. I worked all day to get this fish or kill this bear. Now we're going to consume it immediately. If I'm a worker, I want a job where there's a bunch of businesses for me to choose from so I could have options for where I'm happy. And two, so employers can compete. There's a reason we don't have 100% of people earning minimum wage. It's because employers are competing for better workers. I can't believe this guy got a Nobel Prize, but I heard it was for something legitimate. Do you know what his Nobel? I think it's like free trade or something. The benefits of exchanging goods across borders. Do you
Yeah, it
know
was something
anything
to do
about
with
that?
international trade. I don't know specifically what, but it does blow the mind that he's so highly esteemed in the profession. I mean, Keynesian economics, the whole school of economics, exists for the purpose of manufacturing consent for the institution of central banking, right?
Yeah, that is the best explanation. I can't imagine any Keynesian going to like a third world country and say, "You guys need to spend more." No, they need to
Yeah.
save more and become more productive. Obviously, that is so obviously not the issue.
Yeah.
All right, point number 3. Here's where he really gets serious.
Yeah.
Things aren't always this way, but when they are, the government is not in competition with the private sector. Can we just stop there? The government is not in competition with the private sector. I guess if you're a monopolist who has the legal right to take money coercively and no one else does, that technically means you don't have any competitors. As though, like, if the government takes either $1 million or if they use 1,000 tons of concrete to build a FBI building, or the private sector uses 1,000 tons of concrete to build a church or a Amazon facility, government is in competition with the private sector. People are always in competition or cooperation for the scarce goods that exist. Do you think this is true? The government is not in competition with the private sector when spending is decreased?
No, I mean, it's patently untrue. Of course, because where does the government get the money to spend in the first place? I mean, it's either taxation, in which case, I mean, he can't argue that. Obviously, there's an opportunity cost with the tax dollars, where, like, if it wasn't, if the fruits of my labor weren't forcibly expropriated from me, yeah, I would put them to other use. I would put those funds to other use. So he can't argue that direct taxation doesn't, crowd out private investment and whatever. So what he's talking about is the money printing. but it's not the case that, that there's these idle reserves at banks. We have these high rates of savings, and and so banks have excess reserves, and that they're just sitting there idle, and nobody wants to borrow it and invest it. And so the federal government, it's not as though the federal government is going to like Chase to take out a loan. It's going to the Federal Reserve, which just prints the money out of thin air. So it's not even like he's talking about it as though like the government just uses the same banks that you and I bank at, and just uses those idle resources and just takes of those excess reserves that weren't being lent out anyways, which is complete nonsense. I mean, that's not the same thing at all. No, the government creates IOUs and sells them on the market to institutions, and they have open market operations. But essentially, the Fed just monetizes the government debt, purchases the debt, which creates artificial demand for Treasury debt instruments, pushes interest rates down below where they would otherwise be, and distorts the entire economy. With the consequence in the long term of all the monetary inflation, as the money flows through the economy, and you have this dollar devaluation, and so we are robbed of our purchasing power, and so it's this hidden stealth tax, and so it's just not the case. Like, he's completely ignoring how that we pay for it. It is expropriating our wealth. It is taking wealth from us to be redistributed, and so his whole argument is just completely false here. It's just untrue that the government spending doesn't like crowd out the private spending. I mean, it's just completely untrue. Of course it does.
I think the big confusion for the average Keynesian is to think in terms of money, which could be digits just added to a computer. Like, if you actually look at what the government spending resources, if you look at the amount of steel that they spend to create things which they purchase from defense contractors, if you look at the amount of concrete they spend, if you look at the amount of trees they cut down to make into public school textbooks, then you can actually see that resources are being physically allocated to one group at the expense of being sent to other groups. But I think it's just the fact that he ignores the law of supply and demand. Like, we can clearly see the role of supply and demand when it comes to things like cell phones or t-shirts, or when there's only one popcorn seller at the movie theater, the prices tend to be higher than they otherwise would be. But when it comes to the supply of money, as if a drastic increase in the supply of money doesn't devalue other dollars in circulation, he completely is like, oh, I found a hole in reality where supply and demand does not apply. I guess it's
That's
just
right.
the concept of it's like injecting a drug into someone. I believe Joe Salerno, I'll credit him with this. He gave a speech titled "The Santa Claus Principle versus the Scarcity Principle." He's like, here's why Austrians are hated by politicians. The politicians tell you you can get all this stuff and it's free. We could have free healthcare. We could have free schooling. We could have the military's basically free. Have you ever been sent a bill for the Pentagon? No, it's free. It's basically like the Santa Claus principle. You get a bunch of stuff at no cost. Whereas the Austrians come in and say, for every dollar you spend, those are scarce resources allocated away from what otherwise would be voluntary exchanges in the private sector. So the real disagreement here is Krugman believes in the Santa Claus principle. Ron Paul believes in the scarcity principle. We're not even done with number 3, by the way. He goes on. Government purchases don't use resources that would otherwise be producing private goods. They put unemployed resources to work. All right. So if something is currently, that is the equivalent of saying if someone doesn't have a job now, they'll never have a job. There's no reason they shouldn't be working. Maybe they want to be off for a little. Maybe they want to look around. Maybe they don't know what to spend their money on, so they're waiting for something better to come along. Does the existence of unemployed resources justify the state confiscating trillions every year? Sorry to lead the witness on that one.
Well, no. I mean, his statement, government purchases don't use resources that would otherwise be producing private goods. They put unemployed resources to work. I mean, this is the fallacy we were discussing of, just Yeah, it's the broken window fallacy.
Yeah.
Bastiat, that which is known and that which is not known, right? He's like what he's seeing that okay, you have people without a job, so government spending can somehow create jobs for them, and so now they have a job, and look at the job we created. Well, okay, but you're not looking at how that those expropriated resources otherwise could have been put to more productive use, and it matters how the money is spent, right? It matters what the money is spent on. I mean, you could the government could pay a bunch of people to go around and dig up a bunch of holes and fill them back up again, but that's not going to create economic growth. I mean, that's not indicative of a healthy economy, right? So it kind of matters what the spending is on. And yeah, it's this failure to consider opportunity cost. It's that fallacy.
And you just have to look at the downsides of things government does spend money on. You familiar with the government using its money to murder innocent people overseas? How about the money they use to put people in cages for victimless crimes? How about the money and power they acquire to stop people from starting their businesses to compete with the Walmarts and the Amazons of the world? So this government spending is not much to brag about either. Government borrowing doesn't crowd out private borrowing, it puts idle funds to work. As a result, now is a time when the government should be spending more, not less. If we ignore this insight and cut government spending instead, the economy will shrink and unemployment will rise. In fact, even private spending will shrink because of falling incomes. I think we have more or less addressed everything. If
Mhm.
we ignore this insight and cut government spending, the economy will shrink and unemployment will rise. I think we've gotten everything. Anything more on point number 3?
Well, yeah, just because in the context of his misdiagnosis of the cause of the slump in the first place, he's basically saying here that our goal should be to try to keep the economy on the track it's on, with all of this structural malinvestment that has led to this unemployment in the first place, rather than allowing the market correction so that the economy can kind of jump rails. And yes, that's going to involve, reallocation of resources. And yeah, sure, there's going to be unemployment for a while until things kind of, until the market correction can kind of facilitate the redirection and reallocation of those resources and creation of different jobs and new jobs. And kind of jump track onto a path of real economic growth. And so it's like he's basically arguing, well, we need to keep the economy on the track it's on. And it's like, no, the problem is that it's on this track in the first place, and it's the wrong track. So it kind of like he's overlooking that whole aspect of things because he's misdiagnosed. He's misdiagnosed the cause of the slump in the first place.
It's like he does so little thinking, he assumes it doesn't take time to think. Whereas any business owner is like, all right, before I spend my scarce resources, I have to put a lot of thought. I have to go around and look at places to rent. I have to wait and interview people to see who I can hire. I have to go to customers and see who my customer base can be. I have to market. That takes a lot of time. With that amount of time, you want to have access to quite a bit of savings, which means you're not going to be buying things immediately.
Yeah,
I can't
and
believe this is a real person.
He's talking about putting these idle resources to use, including as though banks have all this money from depositors who are trying to save instead of spending, and they're not lending it for some reason. Well, okay, again, if we had a free market economy, why would it be the case that banks have all this money that they're not lending it? I mean, if banks want to attract borrowers, all they have to do is lower the interest rate. Voila, voila, you've got your borrowers. So why is that not happening? I mean, if you're talking about a situation in which, yeah, the rates of savings are high and they have excess reserves, but people aren't borrowing it, well, why would that be? There's some structural problem. Regime uncertainty. Maybe the regulatory environment is causing regime uncertainty. Excessive bureaucratic red tape preventing new business startups. Overregulation, economic instability caused by things like deliberately shutting down the economy during the lockdowns. I mean, so if there's some structural problem here that would cause that situation, it's not just the case that like that you would have a high rate of savings and excess reserves, and then not an insufficient demand for loans. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. So again, this speaks to his misdiagnosis of the problem.
Point number 4. This view of our problems has made correct predictions over the past 4 years, while alternative views have gotten it all wrong. Budget deficits haven't led to soaring interest rates, and the Fed's money printing hasn't led to inflation. Austerity policies have greatly deepened economic slumps almost everywhere they have been tried. Let's start with this first one. This view of our problems has made correct predictions over the past 4 years, while alternative views have gotten it all wrong. What do you have to say to that?
I love that. So he was writing this in what, February? Like when was that article written? 2000?
April 2013.
Oh, 2013. Oh, okay.
2013. So he goes, all right, since my last prediction caused the crash, I haven't gotten anything wrong. Honey, I haven't cheated on you since you last caught me cheating on you. I haven't committed murder since I last committed murder. Well, that really gives away everything. If you're saying the last 4 years and your
Right.
last prediction caused the last recession.
Right. And okay, so yeah, exactly. We could talk about the 2000s housing bubble, but people can read Ron Paul versus Paul Krugman for that story. But I mean, just look at all the inflation as a result of the lockdown madness. And what were they saying? What were the Keynesians saying? Well, we're not going to have. It's not going to create this price inflation problem. You can ignore all these doomsayers who say that this is going to cause an inflation problem. And then, of course, down the road a little ways, we started seeing the inflation. And what did they say? Well, they said, oh, look, it's transitory. This is just transitory. It's just supply disruptions, and it's going to go away. It'll come back to normal. And then it proved not to be transitory, and it was persistent high inflation. I mean, how many times do they have to be wrong in their predictions? I mean, same with going back to the 2000s. And he was saying that, he was saying then, well, look, the lower interest rates that I advocate aren't causing an inflation problem. But he was looking at the CPI. Well, he didn't look at the stock market, and he wasn't looking at the housing prices. Though that's inflation. It's not necessarily the case that the money, the newly printed dollars, just flow evenly throughout the economy and just show up in the CPI. It's not the case at all. Typically, it's the people who receive the money first are the elite financial class, and they use it to buy up assets before the subsequent rise in prices. And so it flows into things like capital goods or stocks or the housing market, the housing industry. And so that's, he was saying, well, look, there's no inflation, but yes, there was inflation. It was called a housing bubble. Yeah. he completely overlooks that, right?
Yeah. When he says the Fed's money printing hasn't led to inflation, just to your point, it's not that everyone spends the money the second they get it. Some people postpone and spend in certain areas different than they would otherwise areas. This is the equivalent of, we don't know exactly when the inflation is going to take place. We're going by this supply and demand logic because there are so many variables in the economy. It's the equivalent of a guy who says, I've been smoking cigarettes for 10 years and I don't have cancer. Well, okay.
Yes.
It depends on how often you smoke, what your other comorbidities could be. It depends on your age. It depends on the frequency with which you do it. Depends, if you're around other smokers getting secondhand smoke and all this other stuff. So what we're saying is there is a clear correlation that has a causal connection between increase in the money supply, decrease in the value of the dollar, leading to inflated prices. That's our claim. And he wants to play the technicality game of, look, it's been a short while and we haven't seen the inflation yet.
Right.
So if he wants to play this technicality game, I think that alone should explain why he wants to play technicalities, and we're coming up with a much longer view of history based on the concept of supply and demand, something they recognize as legitimate when it comes to any other resource in the economy. So
right. They believe you can legislate away the law of supply and demand. It's like a fundamental assumption, but you can't.
And I don't even see it as a thing that would necessarily be true that, well, over time prices rise. We have many examples of Cornelius Vanderbilt drastically lowering the costs of steamship travel. Computers have drastically lowered in cost and increased in quality. We have microphones. I never could have afforded this thing when whatever it first came out or whenever microphones were first invented. I'm sure they were tens of thousands of dollars in, modern day figures. But I don't even think it's necessarily true that, well, over time prices rise. They act like it's just some law of nature. When
Right.
the production process becomes more efficient, you have more competitors who are able to copycat or innovate from others, and they could be the greediest people in the world, but they still have an incentive to lower their prices. Walmart and Amazon have become successful not because they've sold Rolls Royces to billionaires. They've sold low cost goods to the average person.
Mhm.
So we could also see a reality in which prices are lowered over time. It's not some inevitable law of nature.
No, and in fact, if government wasn't devaluing our currency at such an incredible rate, that would probably be the case generally, that you would have decreasing prices over time as opposed to increasing, all else being the same, precisely because of advances in the means of production.
Mm, yes. Number 5. Yes, the government must pay its bills in the long run, but spending cuts and or tax increases should wait until the economy is no longer depressed and the private sector is willing to spend enough to produce full employment. Anything on point number 5?
Yeah, so he's blaming the problem on businesses just not doing their duty. I mean, it's
No.
absurd. It's ridiculous. Again, this population-wide trend of deferring spending, of saving rather than spending, it's not a problem requiring government intervention. Period. It's not a problem. That's not a problem. He treats it like that's a problem, but it's part of the cure of the economic stagnation caused by government intervention. When times get hard and the economy is bad, well, it makes sense for people to save. That's a smart thing to do. And it's not the case that the slump is the disease requiring the cure of government spending and monetary inflation. Rather, the government spending and monetary inflation is the disease that causes this cycle. And the economic downturn is the cure. It's the market correction necessary to reallocate the resources. And the goal should not be to keep the economy rolling along the track that it's on, this unsustainable path of massive malinvestment, but to get it on the right track. And so the spending cuts that Krugman says are allowable once the economy has recovered, he says that too, that, now is not the time, during the slump, now is not the time for the government to cut spending, and they need to increase spending. And they can cut spending, once the economy is back on its feet again. But that never seems to happen, does it? They never get around to those spending cuts.
When he says spending cuts and or tax increases should wait, I
Or
have to know if he said that with a straight face. I mean, my gosh, don't you just look at the line of government spending since, I don't know, George Washington and see it go in a pretty consistent direction? Even if you take, I will say, there was a spending decrease after the Second World War. I think during the Second World War, it was the highest debt to GDP ratio. But since then, we've had a number of these slumps, and his Keynesian worldview of, I promise, you give us tons of power to put you in jail if you don't fund us now. Once I get more power, once more people are reliant on me for their income, then I'll go back to being nice and stop confiscating as much as I do now. That is such an unbelievable scam. I just wish Amazon would come out and say that. So we should have the right to take people's income by force and cage them. But we'll only do it until there's no more poverty, until there's no more misery, until we have categorized the current state of the economy as not depressed. And then it's totally legitimate. It is so blatantly exactly what you just said, an attempt to justify to the masses the concept of central banking. Wait until the economy is no longer depressed and the private sector is willing to spend enough to produce full employment. So if anyone's unemployed looking for a job, if there are stay-at-home moms, nope, got to get to the factories, ladies. Nope, you're unemployed. You are not using scarce resources to their full potential right now. We must employ you in
You're
the
trying to
economy.
you're trying to save money. You're not doing your duty.
Exactly. Exactly. He must not even have a savings account or a checking account.
Yeah,
He
I
spends
know.
every time he gets a check, he's quick, spend it quick. All right.
Yeah.
So those are his 5 points. I believe we have addressed them in full. Is there anything else on Krugman or Keynesianism?
Well, I would just kind of summarize that government bureaucrats making decisions at best arbitrarily, assuming no corruption in ulterior motives, even acting out of uh, good interests. Um, so government bureaucrats making those decisions arbitrarily at best don't know better than the free market with its pricing system how to efficiently allocate scarce resources toward productive ends as determined by the will of consumers, which is to say by all of us. So there is no greater more perfect manifestation of economic or of democratic principles than the free market. And so this is just one of the fundamental fallacies. It's the fundamental fallacy of socialism and really of any type of government interventionism when it comes to free market versus government intervention. This is the fundamental fallacy that the bureaucrats don't know better than the market with its pricing system how to allocate resources efficiently. And so if we allow the market to function, if we don't try to legislate away the law of supply and demand, things work out.
And they just
And
don't
that's not to
have
say,
the.
yeah, sorry, that's not to say that, that if we had a truly free market, we would be living in some kind of utopia. Of course, there's going to be problems. But, again, this is a situation where the problem isn't that there's a lack of government intervention, and the problem isn't that people are saving. I mean, he's just completely misdiagnosing the problem. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And the claim that, well, the private sector's greedy and the public sector works for everyone, first
Mhm.
of all. Which sounds greedier? Give me your money or I'll cage you. Or give me your money. I'd like to sell you something. Please. Can I try changing it? Can I make adjustments to get your money? So, first of all, the public sector, the involuntary sector is the greedy one. But also, you can look at how it makes bad people do good things and vice versa. There's quite a bit of evidence that a lot of these chief executive officers or people who are categorized as the evil billionaires, if they get access to political power, they could be just as bad as anyone else because they don't have the incentive to say, if people are pissed at me, they might take their dollars elsewhere. They get money involuntarily, so it allows them to get away with doing bad things they otherwise wouldn't have the power to do if they face competition or they faced the freedom of disassociation with consumers. It has been amazing to watch people respond to the Department of Government Efficiency. It is exactly what Antonin Scalia said, I don't know how many decades ago. He said, the welfare state has created donors without love and recipients without gratitude. The more money these people get, first of all, it's theft and it's immoral and it's economically inefficient because it's not productive. But also, even the people getting the money become so reliant on it and so entitled. When you want to talk about cutting any amount for any reason, even if it's blatantly wasteful, people become furious and they hold up signs that say Musk steals. Like that old joke, you're trying to kidnap what I've rightfully stolen. Like the government confiscates money and you want to cut some of that and you're a thief. It is so common that in discussions about school choice, especially in Arizona, school choice is where you must pay for schools through property taxes or the state will confiscate your house. And then if you choose to have children, the state will tell you which schools your children is in the correct district for. And the school choice legislation is allowing you to pick a school outside of your district. The teachers unions treat school choice, they equate it to defunding schools. They're so insecure at the product that they have given so many millions of kids that they say, if you give people a chance to opt out of associating with us,
That's right.
that is the equivalent of taking away everything. Do you think that's helping you in the long run? Yeah, okay, it's helping you in the same way doing heroin helps you. Yes, it feels good temporarily, but in the long run, is that the kind of person you want to become? Someone who acquires resources against the will of the people who've rightfully acquired them? It is just so sad, so pathetic. And that's why the work we do at the Libertarian Institute, I believe, is so important. Check out libertarianinstitute.org/donate. We have tons of free materials on there in article format, blog format, podcast format, video format. Jeremy R. Hammond, any final words or specific things you would like people to check out at the Libertarian Institute?
Yeah, I just want to say, voluntary exchange for mutual benefit is the way to go. Can't beat that. Yeah, I mean, the Libertarian Institute /donate right now. There's a matching fund campaign, I believe, isn't there, Keith?
Yes, there is.
So now is a great time to contribute, if you can, to the Libertarian Institute and all the great work that it does.
Thanks so much to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute podcast. Jeremy R. Hammond, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Keith. Good to talk to you again.